The billionaire had a single father thrown out of her daughter's charity gala in front of hundreds of guests. Only 3 minutes later, that same intruder was the only man standing between her little girl and death. What nobody knew was that beneath the faded janitor's jacket and exhausted eyes, Callum Reed carried a past so dangerous that he had spent years trying to forget it. And when the screaming began inside the glittering ballroom, the billionaire who had humiliated him would discover that the quiet stranger she considered unworthy of her world had once been trained to save lives when everyone else was running for theirs. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel, because sometimes the person we push away is the very person heaven places in our path when we need saving most. The morning of the charity gala began beneath a bright blue sky in the heart of Manhattan, where sunlight poured across the enormous glass walls of the Whitmore Foundation's headquarters. The building belonged to Vivian Whitmore, a 42-year-old billionaire whose name was attached to hospitals, schools, scholarships, and dozens of charitable programs. To the outside world, Vivian was fearless, brilliant, and impossibly successful. Newspapers called her a visionary. Business magazines called her ruthless. Society pages called her one of the most powerful women in America. But there was one title that mattered to her more than all the others: mother. Her 8-year-old daughter, Eloan, was the center of a life Vivian had built almost entirely around protecting her. Eloan had been born with a delicate heart condition that had required several procedures during her childhood. Although doctors believed she was stable, Vivian never stopped worrying. Every skipped breath, every moment of dizziness, every pale expression sent fear through her like a blade. That fear had made her protective, but it had also made her suspicious. She had learned to control every room before anything could go wrong. She controlled her companies, her staff, her security team, her schedule, and even the people allowed close to her daughter. Callum Reed had entered that carefully controlled world by accident. He was 38, a single father raising his 6-year-old son, Finn, in a modest apartment nearly an hour from Manhattan. Callum worked maintenance jobs wherever he could find them, but for the previous several months he had been employed by a contractor responsible for cleaning and maintaining several floors of Vivian's foundation building. He rarely complained about the low pay or long hours. His greatest priority was getting home in time to make Finn breakfast, help with homework, and listen to the little boy describe every detail of his school day. Nobody at the foundation knew much about Callum. They knew he was quiet. They knew he worked hard. They knew he always carried an old silver watch and never drank coffee during working hours. They did not know that the watch had belonged to a teammate who had died years earlier. They did not know that Callum had once served as a Navy SEAL. They did not know that he had survived missions that had left scars beneath his clothing and memories he never discussed. After leaving the military, Callum had deliberately chosen an ordinary life. He wanted his son to know him as a father, not a soldier. On that particular morning, Callum had brought Finn with him because his usual childcare arrangement had fallen through. Finn waited quietly in a staff lounge while Callum finished an early maintenance assignment. The boy carried a small blue backpack and spent most of his time drawing superheroes in a notebook. Callum had promised him they would eat lunch together before returning home. But just before noon, Callum noticed something unusual near the ballroom where the foundation's annual gala was being prepared. One of the emergency exit doors had been partially obstructed by stacked equipment. He immediately moved the equipment aside, checked the door, and reported the problem to a security employee. His military instincts had never completely left him. When Vivian arrived for the final preparations, she was already under enormous pressure. Donors were arriving early, cameras were gathering outside, and a famous senator had unexpectedly changed his schedule. As she walked through the ballroom, she noticed Callum standing near a restricted entrance. His work clothes, worn boots, and tired expression immediately stood out among the tuxedos, gowns, caterers, and security personnel. Vivian asked her head of security why an unauthorized man was inside the gala area. Before Callum could explain, the security chief informed her that Callum was a maintenance worker who had been assigned to the building. Vivian's expression hardened. She was already worried about Eloan, who was scheduled to make a short appearance during the opening ceremony. Callum tried to explain that he had been checking the emergency exit because it had been blocked, but Vivian barely listened. She assumed he had wandered into an area where he did not belong. In front of several wealthy guests and employees, she ordered security to escort him out of the ballroom. Callum did not argue. That was perhaps the most painful part. He simply looked at Vivian for a moment, then lowered his eyes and allowed the guards to lead him away. He had experienced worse humiliation in his life. What hurt was not being removed from a billionaire's gala. What hurt was knowing that his son was watching from the hallway. Finn looked frightened as Callum approached him. Callum crouched beside his son, gently reassured him, and promised that they would go home and have lunch together. He did not tell Finn that his father had just been publicly humiliated. He did not want his son learning bitterness from him. As Callum and Finn reached the building's lower entrance, something changed. Callum stopped. He heard a faint metallic vibration above them. It was subtle. Most people would never have noticed it. But Callum had spent years learning to recognize sounds that could mean danger. His eyes moved toward the ballroom. Then he heard screaming. Callum handed Finn to a nearby trusted employee and told him to keep the boy away from the building. Before anyone could understand what was happening, Callum was already running. Inside the ballroom, the gala had become chaos. A large decorative lighting structure above the stage had begun to detach from its support. At the same moment, an electrical fault caused several lights to flicker violently. Guests panicked and pushed toward the exits. Vivian immediately searched for Eloan. Her daughter had been standing near the stage with a small group of children. Then Vivian saw the enormous lighting structure falling. She screamed. Everything happened within seconds. Callum reached the stage just as Eloan froze beneath the collapsing structure. He grabbed her, pulled her away, and threw his own body over hers as the heavy equipment crashed onto the stage. The ballroom fell silent for a fraction of a second. Then the alarms began. Callum lifted Eloan and carried her away from the debris with astonishing speed. He noticed immediately that the little girl was struggling to breathe. Her face had gone pale. Vivian rushed toward them, terrified. Eloan collapsed against Callum's shoulder. Callum immediately recognized the signs of a cardiac emergency. He asked for her medical bag, but nobody moved quickly enough. He instructed security to clear space, ordered someone to contact emergency medical services, and began carefully monitoring Eloan's breathing and pulse. Vivian was shaking so badly that she could barely stand. Callum remained calm. He knew panic killed precious seconds. When Eloan's breathing became dangerously weak, Callum remembered the medical training he had received during his military service. He stabilized her position, monitored her pulse, and guided the terrified adults around him through the emergency until paramedics arrived. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence. The same man who had been thrown out minutes earlier had become the calmest person in the room. When paramedics rushed in, Callum helped them explain Eloan's condition and told them what he had observed. One of the paramedics immediately recognized that his actions had likely prevented a far more serious outcome. Vivian stood beside her daughter's stretcher, tears streaming down her face. Then she looked at Callum. For the first time, she saw him not as a maintenance worker who did not belong in her world, but as a man who had risked everything for her child. She apologized, but Callum did not accept praise easily. He simply told her that Eloan was what mattered. Later that afternoon, after Eloan had been stabilized at a nearby hospital, Vivian learned the truth about Callum's past. His military record had remained largely private, but the Foundation's security director had discovered that Callum had served as a Navy SEAL and had received commendations for extraordinary bravery during several overseas operations. After leaving the military, Callum had refused lucrative security positions because he wanted a peaceful life with his son. Vivian felt ashamed. She remembered the way she had looked at him that morning. She had judged him by his clothes. She had mistaken poverty for weakness. She had assumed that because he did not belong to her social world, he did not belong near her family. But Callum had never asked for recognition. He had simply done what needed to be done. When Vivian visited him later that afternoon, she found him sitting in the hospital cafeteria with Finn. The boy was eating a sandwich while Callum quietly helped him draw. Vivian approached slowly. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, the billionaire woman who could buy almost anything struggled to find the right words. She apologized sincerely. Not because Callum had saved her daughter, but because she had treated him unfairly before she knew anything about him. Callum listened. He told her that he had been judged many times before and had learned that anger could become another kind of prison. What mattered to him was that Eloan was safe. Vivian admitted that fear had controlled her for years. She had spent so much of her life protecting Eloan from danger that she had forgotten how easily fear could make a person cruel. Callum understood more than she realized. He told her that after losing people in the military, he had spent years believing that keeping everyone at a distance was the safest way to live. Then Finn had changed him. His son had taught him that protecting someone did not mean controlling their entire world. Sometimes love meant allowing people to stand beside you. Those words stayed with Vivian. Over the following weeks, Eloan recovered. She became fascinated by Callum and Finn, not because Callum had once been a SEAL, but because he treated her like an ordinary child instead of a fragile billionaire heiress. Callum never bragged about his military past. He never used it to gain status. Instead, he taught Eloan simple lessons about courage, patience, and helping people who were frightened. Vivian began changing too. She stopped measuring people by their clothes, salaries, or social connections. She started listening to employees. She visited the maintenance staff personally. She learned their names. She discovered that some of the people working in her buildings had been struggling silently for years while she had been obsessing over appearances. Eventually, Vivian offered Callum a senior safety position within the foundation, but he initially refused. He did not want a reward for saving Eloan. Instead, Vivian created a foundation program that provided emergency training, financial assistance, and scholarships for military veterans and single parents. She asked Callum to help design it. He agreed. The program became one of the most meaningful projects either of them had ever worked on. Callum still wore simple clothes. Vivian still ran a billion-dollar company. Their worlds remained very different, but something changed between them. Respect came first. Then friendship. And slowly, something deeper began to grow. There were no grand declarations. No extravagant gifts. No attempt to force a perfect romance. There were shared lunches, conversations about their children, quiet walks through the foundation's garden, and moments when Vivian realized that she no longer felt the need to control every second of her life. One bright afternoon several months later, Vivian stood outside the foundation's newly opened Veteran Center with Eloan and Finn beside her. A bronze plaque had been placed near the entrance. It did not mention Callum's military medals. It did not mention the gala. It simply carried a message about courage, compassion, and second chances. Eloan reached for Callum's hand. Finn reached for Vivian's. For a moment, the four of them stood together beneath the warm afternoon sun. Vivian looked at Callum and remembered the day she had ordered him out of her gala. She had thought she was protecting her world. Instead, she had almost missed the person who would teach her what her world had been missing. Callum looked down at the children and smiled. His past would always be part of him, but it no longer controlled him. He had spent years learning how to survive danger. Now he was learning something harder and more beautiful, how to live without fear. Vivian had spent years building an empire. Now she finally understood that the greatest fortune was not money, influence, or power. It was having people beside you who stayed when you had nothing left to offer. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you leave, tell us in the comments what you believe the greatest lesson of Callum and Vivian's story was. Was it forgiveness, humility, courage, or the importance of never judging someone by appearances? Because sometimes life introduces us to the people we need in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes the person we reject carries the strength we desperately need. And sometimes the greatest second chance begins the moment we finally admit that we were wrong. Vivian once threw Callum out because she believed he did not belong in her world. But in the end, she discovered that he had never needed to belong to her world. He had come to teach her how to build a better one.